Okay, thank you all very much for being here on day 2 of ARTinD, day 2 of Conversation Platform. We're very, very lucky today. I won't do introductions, so all be introducing themselves, but we have Lucian, founder of Sifang Art Museum, who's also presenting ARTinD on the second floor, the artist residency program of the museum. We have Alina and Oliva Sartogo of ARTinD, which is kind of art and architecture collaboration. They'll explain it much better than I will. And Nicole, Ching, co-founder of Museum 2050. So I'll let you guys get on with it. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you, Stefano. Hi everybody, thank you Stefano for the introduction. And I'm really happy to be here at ARTinD. Very thankful for organizing this and putting us all together in this panel. So I'll start introducing ARTinD. We started with Alina 2 years ago, this project, and the idea was to put together artists and architects and make architects to collaborate and actually be linked and in dialogue between each other. And so the first project was how do I put together, architects such as Norman Foster, Peter Eisenman, Tom Wayne, Sue Fujimoto, Peter Zuntor, and all asked them to collaborate, since they're all very busy building buildings around the world, but they never actually collaborate and are in dialogue. So the first project was a concept that they had to develop around the golden section, and they had to think about a space which was a 5 meter by 5 meter space, and each of them had to come with an idea of the golden section within the space. So as you can imagine, they all developed this project in a completely different ways. I'm going to show you. So these are the architects that participated on our first project. Very different, so we had Alessandro Mendini and then Norman Foster, Peter Zuntor, Peter Eisenman, so very different between them, and also by the practice, by their culture, and that was also one of the key points, was to choose architects that always work with different materials, different philosophy. And so this is how they developed the project. And we worked 2 years to develop the space, this concept, into a realistic space, and through a hand-knotted, let's say, carpet, or it was, some of them were carpet, some of them were more like installation, like Fujimoto with this kind of modular idea of the golden section within taking the space. And then Peter Eisenman instead did a wall, the idea of taking the wall with the golden section. And through this, I discovered that the architects were also not in touch with artists, and there was also a big gap between artists and architects, and how in public space and also within the buildings of the architects which we work, there was not really an interaction with the artists. So I started a conference program, which was Art and Architecture in Dialogue. We started with a conference in Engadine, with Ben van Berken, my father, Ross Sachs, and Domenico Raimondo, and talking about the dialogue between art and architecture in a creative way. This was the first talk was how architects and artists have the drawing as their main point in common, and how the creativity through the drawing was important, and how, for example, within our project of this golden section, the drawing was a very important phase of the project. And then, so this is Ben van Berken Pavilion, Ross Sachs Works. Then the second talk was in London with Sue Fujimoto, Nathalie Crenon, and Anthony Womby, and we talked about the interaction of art and architecture within a city context. So, especially how, for example, for Anthony Womby was very important to be in dialogue with the city, with human scale, and how this was sometimes conceived with architect, and sometimes actually was just an element put it at the end of an architectural project, and how this for an artist was very problematic, because for them, it became like an object and not anymore a project. And so how important it was to actually reconnect and create projects together. yeah, so Fujiwara as well, which was also talking about his pavilion at the Serpentine, and how for him was very important as well, how humans were interacting with his space, and in a way which was very different to an architectural project, because the Serpentine was an installation, much more interactive with the people, and yes, creating a flow of humans. And here you have quotes. Then we continued, we did a talk in New York with Peter Eisenman, Joseph Kossuth, and Beim Stenbach. And there we mainly focused on Peter Eisenman project in Berlin, which was conceived with Richard Serra. So it was a dialogue between, this is the Berlin Memorial, which was a dialogue with Richard Serra, started with Peter Eisenman, and then actually developed more with Peter Eisenman and Richard Serra had to drop because of political situation. So how architects are much more facing political situation, let's say city problematics, and how instead artists are more like conceiving the idea and then developing, but less having to do with the so how this was dialogue. Then we continue the talk with Tom Main in Los Angeles, and then I'm not going to tell you all the talk, but I'm just giving you a bit of a brief of what we're doing. And then to come to Hong Kong, where we did a talk with Nicole, bridging artists, architects, but there as well with institutions. So we started a dialogue with Michael Xufu and Pat Kanduk, who both created museums, are created or have created museums. And actually there was very interesting to see how Bank and Duncan with the West Kowloon is a very long-term project, inviting architects to work, creating museums, but it's a 20 years old project, and how this is, what's the relation with the community, and how architects and artists are engaging with the community through a project of 20 years old, idea, instead of Michael Tsufu project, which was a very, short-term, like, in 6 months they built the first museum, they have millions of people visiting, and so what's the link between the two, how they create their communities. And this is where, with Nicole, we were very interested in this dialogue, and that's where we started, and we were very happy to bring it here to us and now, this dialogue, because it's a continuation of where we started in Hong Kong. So, yeah. Then we did a talk in London again with Toby Ziegler and Ishigami. And here we're talking a lot about virtual reality and what's the future of building with such a tool, with, how are we, how are we visioning the future with these technologies in art and architecture. So I'm now passing to, I hope I give you a good brief introduction about what we're doing, ARTinD and our talk programs. And Nicole is going to continue.
Hi everyone, I'm Nicole Ching and I'm the co-founder of Museum 2050. And in everything that we do, the question that we're raising today, what is the evolution of the form and function of cultural institutions, is something that we ask ourselves on the daily. Museum 2050 was born out of the belief that so much of what was happening in terms of China's cultural development wasn't being precisely depicted in many of the talks and publications that we were seeing outside of China. My co-founder and I both have experience working in Chinese institutions, and we also understand many of the challenges that these institutions are facing on the daily. And we wanted to do something that would give back and also give these young museum professionals the tools to help improve their institutions from the inside out. And most of all, we wanted to create a space to converse, to share our ideas, and to create a vibrant museum community in China. We had our inaugural symposium in Shanghai at the Long Museum almost 3 years ago now, where we sought to carefully examine the diverse museum practices in both official and private domains in the Greater China region. We recently just wrapped up our second annual symposium in Chengdu at the Zhe Art Museum, which focused on redefining museums and also asking about proposals for museums of the future. I'm so excited to be here today to share about what we as Museum 2050 do. And in light of today's focus on the changing nature of cultural institutions, I hope to share a bit more about our organization and how we support and hope to support and nurture the ever-changing cultural landscape of China. Many of you will know about the kind of general museum boom that's been happening for a while now in China, the so-called museum a day phenomenon. Despite being a relative latecomer to the private museum scene, China already ranks 4th in the world for its number of private art museums. The phenomenon is largely connected with China's goal announcing in 2005 that by 2015 they would build 1,000 museums, which seems almost an impossible feat, but they actually achieved it far ahead of time. And since then, kind of 4 years ahead, one can only imagine how many more there are. The phenomenon has largely cultivated a lot of opportunities for museums in China, and especially for the next generation, one made up of a burgeoning middle class who are eager to kind of consume differently and consume voraciously, and also how they can engage that with museums. Audiences, as we have touched on, kind of are skewed young and they're getting increasingly younger. Museums are also developing free from expectations of how museums should be. And also, there is great governmental support of cultural institutions through new regulative functions. Altogether, this means there is infinite potential for innovative forms and new models of museum. However, with opportunities come challenges, and a lot of these challenges that private museums in China are now facing are kind of very specific to the region, such as problematic funding structures, an emphasis on hardware instead of software, often an undervaluation of professional expertise, and also a shortage of staff, which can all lead to a high turnover rate in terms of employees.
What do you mean by emphasis on hardware
So thinking about, we have the infrastructure, we have the building, but everything that happens kind of within it. So, staff, curation, programming, and so on. And so under these specific opportunities and challenges, we continue to ask ourselves, what is the future of cultural institutions in China, and what role can we play in it? We're a platform for investigating kind of key issues about the future of cultural institutions in China from a local perspective. We also aim to serve as a resource for young people all over China who kind of inhabit these museums and really work within them. And we want to bring people together to be really able to have that conversation, to share ideas, and most of all, like I said earlier, to create that vibrant museum community. We do this through various events. First of all, we have an annual symposium where we announce a call for paper yearly, and our advisory committee chooses papers to select and to be presented at this symposium, alongside invited keynote speakers, thereby supporting the research of up-and-coming scholars. We also host regular professional development workshops focusing on career development workshops for young arts professionals. In our closed-door sessions, attending museum staff would be able to not only hear from experts in their field, but also ask questions and participate in moderated discussion and learn from the shared experiences of their peers. Our hope is that this will lead to not only strengthening connections between museums in a place like China, which is completely vast, and often cities can feel like unique ecosystems with very little conversation with one another, but also to instill a greater sense of community and an ability to share resources and work through problems together. Within our workshops, we endeavor not just to focus on the curatorial team or the academic side of it, but also on functions and people working in different sectors in the museum, such as marketing and PR, financing, and also exhibition production. In our first museum conference, we welcomed staff from over 12 museums from all over the country, kind of from China, from Beijing to Shanghai to Suzhou to Guangzhou, kind of you name it. And our list of partners has only grown since then. We're very grateful for that. In accordance with our mission to provide this platform for young academics, many of whom are doing really exciting research on the cultural institutional sphere in China, we also publish our conference proceedings, and we do this every year in both Chinese and English. And we have forwards kind of from our advisory committee, and these are available online and also in many museum bookshops in China. Alongside this, when we did our book launch at the Asian Society in Hong Kong 2 years ago, we also organized a panel discussion alongside Tobias Berger, P. Lee, John Tain, and Alice Long. And we question, should institutions collaborate with one another, and if so, how? That's a question for another day. In line with our spirit of collaboration, we teamed up with Oliva and ARTinD Design, which she so succinctly mentioned earlier, so I won't touch on that anymore. But today we hope kind of to serve as the second part of the conversation that we so established there, and kind of to be able to bring that dialogue between art, architecture, and especially what's kind of happening in Asia now to Paris. The forthcoming proceedings from our Chengdu conference, featuring all the papers and kind of forwards from our workshop contributors, will be launched to coincide with the Hong Kong Art Fair, Hong Kong Art Book Fair, and also we'll be announcing our call for papers very soon, so definitely stay tuned for that. And thank you very much. Please find me if you have any questions afterwards.
So we did go there. We want to go over the
Just for Museum 2015, I say West Fund. It's the same association which works with Sartogo, Center of Competition. It's the same. It's long.
Yeah, exactly. So the Westbound Cultural Corridor in Shanghai is a kind of government-sponsored initiative that has invited kind of lots of private collectors to open their institutions there, and obviously the forthcoming opening of Pompidou there this November. Yeah, so it's the same organization, same area.
Okay. And how do you think the perspective of this cooperation from a point of view of private institution? Thank you.
In terms of the Pompidou, I think it's incredibly exciting. Has endless potential, and obviously it's too early to say since it hasn't opened yet. But come November, then we'll definitely see. And I'm sure I'll have a really great event.
This is back to the book, so I'll go really quickly. So back in 2006, China had a very different landscape in terms of designers, architects, artists. It was a time when really, really good individual architect offices don't get a lot of opportunities to build. There was a really famous show in Berlin where some of the best architects, but they all have really small offices. They came to Berlin, did a gallery show, and suddenly internationally people know about them. So it was a time when design, was not so appreciated. And the Chinese cities are all built by big real estate developers, which always use architectural offices from affiliated universities. So they're huge architectural offices, like 200, 300 people, basically doing like a factory making drawings there. So all the cities look very alike. It was kind of that era. So we thought we wanted to do something quite different to that approach. So we decided to commission 24 architects from around the world. So 12 from China, representing the best Chinese creative minds at the time, and 12 international. The international ones were selected by the famous Japanese architect Alina. This is a really early rendering that we did in early 2000. You can see the museum on top. The museum is designed by Stephen Hall. And the one here is Arata Izuzaki, Edward Sosa from Italy, Liu Jiakun, Ai Weiwei, Wang Shu. So there's basically, looking now, there's 4 offices that received placement prize. The time when we commissioned them, it was 0. So all of them became really, really well famous and renowned. Yeah, it was a scorching hot summer day. Everyone flew to Nanjing, and we cut up the land 24 lots, and it was numbered in the cup. So they all drew on the cup because we wanted to be fair. Yeah, it was a group commission at one time, because people sometimes commission one by one, but we commissioned them all at one time. So they all came, and we wanted to be fair. We don't want anybody to be not happy about their land. So we did a lucky draw. So they're all holding a number. So after this draw, they went out to the site and checked out their price. They went home, designed for about a year and a half, and we started construction in 3 years. So I founded the museum. So basically, founding means the architecture finished in 2011. But basically, when I say I founded, basically it means we started the program. We started the program in 2013. So that's the museum by Stephen Paul. Empty pictures taken a long time ago. This is a hotel. Really quick. This is this building. It's a conference center. And they're all finished now. Sources. Pictures is also finished. The famous Sana office in Japan. We did beautiful, very poetic architecture on the lake. And here's class from Chile. And a beautiful blig on the roof of the building. Ajay from London. A beautiful house, and I use this house for artist residence. So if you guys have time, I show a very small section in the fair, and I brought this really interesting, unique artist book. Basically, it's a book made for that special residence program. So I did the residence program for 20 artists, and they stayed in the museum site. Most of them stayed in this building for half a year. They made gigantic, tremendous amount of videos, poetry, paintings, everything, because they stayed there for so long. That's all they could do. And I just brought them whiskey, and they just kept drinking and kept making. The Chinese architects, we kind of knew who they were, because there were not many at the level at the time. So we choose 12. I would say about 7 or 8 are international level. Yes. But international level is such a great pool of international architects. So we asked Ms. Lucky to choose. So he was kind of the curator. It's like you do an exhibition, like here is a choose artist, And architect, we call it an architectural exhibition. But architectural exhibitions, you show models, you show drawings, but this one is not. This one we actually built the buildings. It took us almost 10 years to complete all of it. Sean Gossell, Australian architect.
You were happy with these lucky choices? You never had
Yes.
a discussion?
Huh?
You never make all of these choices with all these?
We didn't question his choice of architects, but we have a jury. We had a jury of looking over the design. So Izaki was quite liberal in terms of, because we're the client basically. And there were a few first proposals where we rejected and go back and do it again. But we didn't question the architect office. So Wang Shu, the only Chinese architect who received this 2 years ago. Beautiful, modernist, but in a very Chinese traditional way.
And you knew exactly from the beginning, you knew exactly how many residents you needed and how the museum structure had to be. The brief was done by.
The brief was very simple. basically number of square meters. So the museum had a number of square meters, right? And we also did 20 houses, and the houses are even more simple, just 500 square meters, 4 bedrooms, living room. It's very, 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 very China style, very, very simple. Yeah. So they have lots of freedom, basically.
You had already a collection? You had a collection already that you knew how big, like to establish the museum?
Yes.
So maybe you had a collection that you knew you wanted to put
Yes,
in.
the collection was mainly paintings, but after the museum we started to collect a lot of many different things. I don't know if we have pictures here, but in the first show I showed Young Bo's Statue of Liberty piece. We had about 20-25 pieces inside. We showed William Kendrick, we showed a lot of installations, videos, sculptures.
And how did you choose the location of the museum? Because I think that what struck me the most when I heard about it is that it's, not close to a city that at least people in Europe know of. Not seems to be one of the historical cultural centers of China either. And yes, and I mean, I'm saying this, I'm extremely ignorant about it, but from an ignorant perspective, that's at least the first feeling. And it's sort of a tendency that I've seen is developing more and more through time. Museums opening in the middle of nowhere, or call it what you want, instead of in the city centers of large cities, which used to be what happened in the last 50 years. So how did you decide to go and build such a huge museum with 24 incredible architects bringing amazing artists in the specific location? Because I guess it wasn't a random allocation.
Well, this would never be able to do in a city environment. Yeah, because this is something we kind of created a small city out of nothing. It was when we first went there, we had to use the GPS to kind of guide our direction. It was all forested. It's a beautiful place with a lake in front, and then we're back facing the mountains. So the government wanted us to do something. They give us land basically for good price, but in exchange of that, we had to do cultural institutions and like interesting projects. The government doesn't really know what to expect, so we had to propose a good proposition.
And to what extent the community is now involved in? To what extent is the local community now actually
There were
involved?
no community at the time.
Oh, wow.
Right now there is, because the city grew a lot. Yeah, we're about 30 minutes away from the city center. But when we first built, it took about an hour to get there because we're on the other side of the Yangtze River. And within the past 10 years, there's 3 tunnels being built underneath the river, so much more convenient right now. And before there was nothing. This is like really natural, just like in the mountains. There's no community. Right now there is. This is a Finnish art. Okay, I don't have art. This is the wrong PDF. Anyway, so the museum, we do 3 shows a year, and it's contemporary art theme. And think about these architecture as a canvas. So what we do now are putting paint onto the canvas. So these are large-scale commissions, art commissions, large-scale outdoor commissions, either between the buildings, some are inside, some are outside. So I do 2 commissions every year. Yeah, so buildings are finished, but the outdoor sculptures and these specific commissions are still growing. I did a project 3 years ago and commissioned 20 projects, specific projects. Yes, but not in our campus because our campus cannot hold that many. So we asked the government to give us a big natural site and commission 20 projects. Some of them still remain.
I have a question. Once the architect, it's a residency for architects and artists at the same time, or is the residency for artists?
Just artists, yes.
So what's your relation with
Some
architects
writers,
once that the
writers.
buildings are, once that the building has been created? Are you continuing the dialogue with the architects? Like, are you inviting the architects to, create and do installations still at the museum, or is it very like the architects are for the building and the artists are there?
Yes, yes, most of these artists are very busy. So,
Like shows of the weekend or shows.
oh yeah. We just did the Stephen Hall retrospective in the museum last year. Yeah. And it's the first time he comes back, even. Yeah. And we're gonna do a huge Arata Isozaki retrospective, but our museum is only going to be one part of that show because Arata is organizing a countrywide, basically 5 parts in 5 different institutions around China. So each part is a very important aspect of his practice. So in our museum, it's going to be his curatorial practice because he's a great influencer and he supported many younger architects, and he's kind of like he makes things happen, especially. So these kind of projects, I think Arata was really influential because he was able to convince us, and this is something like one cannot imagine to do something like super ambitious, but he was able to convince us that this is something that we should do, something that we should pursue. So he really influenced Steve. He brought all of these architects to China for the first time. None of them ever came to China before. And then after this project, so this is Stephen Hall's first project, and then Stephen Hall liked China so much he opened his Beijing office, and then did many big-scale commercial projects. But at the end, he loved this one the most because this one is almost like a conceptual model. Yeah, it's like a concept.
And no, I mean, going back into Oliva's comments, because if you have an artist residency program, have you ever thought of doing an architect's residency program where they can, as young, up-and-coming architects, work with artists, see the surrounding and take advantage of it as well to develop their own ideas?
Good idea. Maybe we can do like designing pavilions and some smaller things, but mostly because we have to do within our own capabilities. Artists, they use their hand to make, they paint. So it's easy. Light is the light. But architects, it's a nightmare to work with one architect. Think about working with 24 architects. 24 offices around the world, different time zones and different habits. Like Sana office never reply. It's so difficult to. They're too busy with all the projects.
And also, for when you were doing the brief for the building, for example, for the museums and for all the residencies, like as a collector, because you come from collectors again, and that's where you started. Like, I'm wondering, like all the technical, all the because also what's the future of the museum institution? So with VR, and like what technology do we need in a museum? How did you, we're kind of short to showcase even more. Yes, for the museum, and also for the residency is easier, but for the museum, like for the weight of the sculpture, then the capacity, of the technical details as well.
To be honest, when we commissioned the museum, when we commissioned the museum, it was 15 years ago, 10 years ago, and we had no idea at all about how to show art or whatever. So it was a simple brief from Stephen, and Stephen took it very far. And I wish we had more experience. Like if I was able to commission another building now, I would give them exact. But that's it's a double-sided sword. Stephen was able, because of a very simple brief, so he was able to make one of the best buildings in his career. Like I said, it's super conceptual. It's this cantilever structure. He extended the idea. He called it the horizontal skyscraper. So he used the idea in his later China projects, but this one is the most avant-garde. Yeah.
But you conceived it more as as a sculpture object, I guess, than as a
Exactly. I think that's also what makes our space interesting. If I was to commission someone, I would give them for 5 meters high. And that kind of it stops people's creativity.
The shed that actually moves. No, the new museum, the shed that actually moves. And
really, I didn't know that.
in New York, the shed which is actually you can extend the museum and becomes a huge performance space and for huge sculptures. So how architects now are thinking about, for example, large-scale sculpture or performances. I mean, we have the example of the Max Museum in Rome, which is very similar. It's more like a sculpture museum than actually.
It just means that the things we show in the museum are a little bit more limited, and also artists have to think how to interact with the space. Like I said, we don't take travel shows. We never take travel shows because our space does not allow that. So all our shows are original. So we create all the shows ourselves. So it's always about talking to the artists, talking to the architects. It's long conversations for every show, and the artists sometimes they stay there. So we partner up the residency with the exhibition. So they will come, either they come for several times or they stay there for a long time. And during that conversation, we start to the artists really need to be there to understand. We cannot work the international art world way, which is the artist comes 3 days before and install everything, the museum prepare everything, and the artist comes and
because your museum has a lot of glass and light.
Yes. Some artists are super excited to see that. Some artists are architectural. Some artists sometimes some artists think it's a nightmare. Yeah, sometimes we cannot show anything here. So,
yeah, I mean, it's either the white box
yeah.
or an architecture that actually has huge power in itself, and then for the artist it might be more complicated.
Yes.
But I have to say, I mean, it's interesting to hear you say that you conceive of these. Everything you do is long term. Your exhibitions span half a year. You do the residencies, which similar timing. I think for anyone that knows kind of the general museum scene in China, that's almost like the opposite of how most people work in terms of how they conceive their programming and so on. And I think a lot of people explain that in the way that, trends are changing so quickly and so on, and you want to be responsive to that. But I think, I'd love to hear from you, there's kind of importance in thinking long-term and sustainability as well. And so, I want to hear more from you about how you see that difference and what you as Sifang Museum are doing that's different to other institutions in China.
Well, everyone knows that once you install a show and the show comes down, will go away in 3 months, right? And either you're left with the catalog or book, but just contemporary art is all about that moment you're in front of the artwork. So for us, like you said, our show are longer, first. Second, a lot of these shows generate a permanent work that's always on view. So either these are discussed before, or because we've done a show and the artists really like the space and they understand the space. So he goes out of the museum and choose a place for permanent work to be installed. So all of these things, we're adding all these permanent, semi-permanent, site-specific works. So every time people come, they can see it. So they don't have to miss any exhibitions.
Well, I have a question, because it's a private museum, private institution, and I'm wondering how is the relation between private institution in China and public one, and how you bridge those two, and because I've heard, we hear in Europe much more about the private one, so I'd like to know.
Well, I'm sure, you can kind of contribute a lot more to this question as well, but I think as of now, in terms of like the mandate and the missions of public and private, they're slightly different. As in the beauty of private museums is that you have the freedom to, really create the program and so on, as in anywhere. And with, I think in China, the public museums, they're very much more focused on, for example, archaeological finds. So you have these kind of great provincial museums that are representative and kind of build their collections around a few very famous archaeological finds. And then, there are reciprocals for example, if the Tate does a big exhibition, then they'll often host traveling exhibitions. And so, I think, even if you look at numbers, the kind of public sector museums, they host, millions and millions, whereas I feel like and you know this as well, with private museums, the numbers still lag behind, but I feel like they engage with their audiences in a very different way. For example, you know, most private museums have great public programming, you know, they are very much more international facing, which is why you definitely hear about them more here. And also, you know, they have this conception of the digital, you know, which is something that came up in Hong Kong as well, this conception of the digital audience versus physical footfall. And often there's that disparity which exists between the public and private sectors as well. But what do you think?
Well, people hear about, you know, all the museums being constructed in China. You said a museum a day.
Yeah.
Is that true? People say that. But anyway, I saw this newspaper says like 2,500 within 2 or 3 years or something. Yeah. However, among this number, there is very, very few museums dedicated to contemporary art. Yeah, and also very, very few is private. So all of these museums are, well, most of them are public museums. There's only, I think there's 1 or 2 public museums dedicated to contemporary art, PSA. PSA is also architecture and contemporary art. So basically contemporary art, the obligation of showing contemporary art are within the private museum's hands. And the public museums, there's all kinds of things, textiles, antiques, historical, stories, revolution, red theme, you know, all kinds of things. But
So is there any interaction between public and private museums, or not at all?
there's not even, we're not even doing the same things. So
Yes, but for example, you could think of doing, as a contemporary museum, partnership with a textile museum, working with contemporary artists that work on textiles. And I'm saying this just because it's things that tend to happen sometimes in other countries, and sometimes it's actually good to take the contemporary art out of its context of a contemporary museum.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that, but if really you think long and hard about what kind of foundations are doing that here, it's also not that many.
No.
Yeah.
It's more a question, I mean, does it happen at all, or does it not happen at all, but there is scope for development? Or actually, no, public institutions are administered in such a way that in China it would make it nearly impossible to have this sort of cooperation between the two worlds.
I mean, I think in terms of this cooperation, you know, so much of what we do is about sharing resources and collaboration, and, you know, obviously us as an organization, we'd love to see more of that. But in terms of that existing now, you know, I don't know many examples, which is a bit of a shame.
What kind of budget do you have for your project yearly?
it depends on the project.
Yes. Must be huge.
No, not necessarily.
Is the funding coming from the government, or is it all private money?
Which one?
Your
Which one?
project?
Private.
All private.
Yeah.
And what role does censorship play, if at all? Censorship? Yeah.
Well, just don't touch the fun lines. There's what? Nudity? Absolutely cannot. Which is so common here. In China, if there's nudity, then censored.
And if it's complicated to discuss with the government or the problem with the field,
I think what you meant is that they got the actual location of the site from the government. Yes. So how was it to interact with the government when they gave you their parcel, or they sold you for a low price the parcel? Did they have any impact on that afterwards? Or you could do whatever you wanted? That's my understanding of what you were explaining before. But
What do you mean?
When they allocated the space.
When they allocated the land?
Yeah, the land.
Well, in China, the builder's code is extremely strict. Yeah, these kind of things will never be able to be built in China. Basically, government gave us green light for this project. Yeah, it does not submit to any of the building codes. Okay, building codes require you to have fire regulation. You know, all of these. I'm sure it's the same in Europe. It's extremely difficult. But I'll tell you an interesting story.
Supporting contemporary architecture.
Sorry?
The government is extremely supportive. Like, they don't build contemporary museums, they're very supportive
understanding that you could have done a deal and that is not on the condition.
I don't think they fully. Yes. It's the government. For the government, it's a lot about like number of visitors, a very number of days. But I just want to tell an interesting story because this is really bad. We're on the middle peninsula. It's a peninsula, very difficult to tell. But the government, there's 4 pieces of lands, and another company got the other land, and we didn't have this land first, and we were given another one next to it, and we did all the master planning. All the master planning was done, so all the fees decided to be paid, all master planning, and the architects were already planning to come to Nanjing, come to China. On the one day before the architects flew in, the government said, "We're not giving you this land anymore." So they give us the one next to it, although it's a better lot, but we had nothing done to it, right? Because the architects come, we have to have a master plan. Master plan needs to build the main vehicular road, and all the lots being divided. So it was a lot of work, and they're already flying in. We don't have any preparation work.
Very Chinese.
Very, very Chinese. But think about this project. This project we did, almost like 15, 20 years now. We spent so much time, energy, resources onto this project. But think about how it started. Just think about this contrast. And basically, we did the master planning overnight in 10 hours. Yeah, almost like 3 months of work. We do it again on this new land in 10 hours. And the architects go in, select the lots. Yeah, like nothing happened.
I have a question to Nicole and because you say numbers are so important for the public administration. Is that why we see a lot, what we perceive is that we see a lot of, large scale installation where you kind of, this kind of be all like very public, like bringing a lot of people just very sparkling exhibition. Is that due because the numbers are so important? Because
big effect.
I can comment from a more general perspective. This is not to say that obviously it's
Michael Sufu compared to, Michael built his entire museum on numbers and on how customers numbers.
Well, I think the thing with private institutions in China is that they're completely privately funded, right? And that obviously in the US when you have private museums, because of the nature of philanthropic giving in the US and obviously tax benefits and so on, there is incentive, for you to be supported by other foundations and so on, whereas that doesn't exist in China. And so numbers obviously help in terms of ticket sales and getting recognition and kind of getting sponsorship. And so I think that's why if I was an individual kind of thinking about programming for my museums, naturally numbers is important. And that's another question to say whether that affects the kind of like cultural programming or creation. But I think, in any case, it would be almost naive to not think about numbers.
Yes, but by the fact that it's, as you say, in a space which is in the middle of nature compared to a big city.
We're not thinking about numbers.
Yeah, exactly. So that was my thing. It's also very...
Because even if we do like a big blockbuster show, the audience is the same, right? But
which protects your program.
Exactly.
It protects a lot of your program.
Exactly. So I can do long-term collaborations. I can do, But if the museum was in Shanghai, I would be forced to do blockbuster shows, right? Why would you not? But in China, it happens so fast. 5 years ago, nobody goes to museums. Nobody goes to see a contemporary art show. Nobody. But now everybody goes. The best date for young couples are in museums. Right? It changes so quickly. And now this year, I think I'm seeing, less now. I think it peaked a little bit last 2-3 years. Now, like people, in Shanghai, things happen so fast. A super trendy, delicious restaurant goes out of fashion in 2 weeks. Okay, so.
But it's a way of protecting as well.
Yeah.
It's a way to protect.
Yeah. But I think it's great because you get the young couple, you get the middle class into the museum to learn about, because contemporary art is new. You have to get them kind of accustomed to seeing it, and then you start preparing probably more difficult material, more provocative, critical material. But you have to get this audience to see, have to develop a habit first. But that happened really quickly. So now I think we're going to see more institutions kind of thinking long and hard about their program. Also because we have better staff now. Yeah, it was difficult to get good staff.
That's where Nicole comes.
Yeah, a few years ago. Yeah.
If you had 3 tips to give to someone who wants to build a museum from scratch, which would be your 3 top tips? And also Nicole probably has good ideas.
Never, don't. Never. I love it. Most companies.
I think there's a question from the floor.
But want to answer first on the tips?
With 3 tips.
I think I'm very
You're stopping.
Maybe. I mean, I'm kind of like woefully not prepared to answer that question. You know, definitely Lucian is definitely more, you know, has that experience.
I'm happy to ask my question. So I think it's difficult to not, especially as Europeans, not think of China as, for us, what's very exciting is that there's this huge digital maturity, and I think what's interesting is that when you see the impressive numbers of all these cultural institutions growing and being built and conceptualized in last years, I was wondering how digital was inbuilt within those cultural institutions right from the beginning. I think us in Europe, because we have older institutions and we're growing not as fast, we have a lot to learn from that. So I would love to have a bit of your return of experience on that whole relationship with digital and how it's impacting your cultural institutions, or in general, Chinese cultural institutions.
I mean, I can speak a bit generally, and then, so I think what you see is, for example, when you go to a museum here, kind of a wall text is so integral to the kind of museum experience, whereas, more often than not, when you go somewhere in China, you'd be asked to scan a QR code, and then you'd have a mini program on your phone that would take you through the paces of the exhibition, and also kind of leaves something for afterwards, so you can go home and ponder that. And you'll have that kind of digital manifestation of what you've seen on your phone for perpetuity, or whenever you want to delete it or whatever. And I think in terms of, as you know from asking the question, I think China is going through this kind of digital renaissance over and over again, and their relationship with the phone changes so much. For example, for me, I'm on my phone 24/7, whether it be on WeChat or, everything, and I think that the fact that a lot of museums have programmed the digital into, understanding their audiences and how they want to engage with exhibitions, and, even how they buy tickets, how they find out information. And, I think that's incredibly important, and but it's, at the end of the day, I think it all comes down to audiencing, so, for example, yes, there's a lot to learn, but also you have to see if there's a desire for that, and I think so often people don't ask the second part to that question.
I mean, I find it fascinating how during in Hong Kong you were showing how Michael was you just put it online and then how that was creating even then they have visitors. So how the online created for him the entire show, the basic show.
But obviously with something like the Sifang Museum, it's different, right? It's a lived experience. You have to go, you have to see it, and so I'd be interested what you think about the kind of digital in terms of. Good. Any more questions from the floor?
I was amazed by the project that you have made in Nanjing because this year I had the chance to go to this beautiful city. It was really nice, and the environment of the museums are really nice, and it's so attractive. I'm just wondering, because it's a very modern museum, do you take in consider the
ecology, the environment protection into the project of the museum, because the museum is located in the forest beside a very beautiful lake. So I had just I'm really afraid that with lots of shops, lots of capital sectors will enter into this small town of art, because lots of artists, lots of visitors, they live here or they need to go there, they need to buy something if they want to buy something. So there will be shops, there will be restaurants, and what do you think about it? How to have a balance between environment and the museum and the conservation of the visitors and the artists. Food for thought.
Yeah, I think we're running the environment as well.
There's no commercialization. So basically, government it's a protected area, so you cannot have shops, you cannot have a lot of things. And this is a destination, so whatever that's built is built. Government does not allow anything else to be built. It's very strict, super strict. Of course, we have a museum shop, we have a hotel, so people can stay in the hotel, but it's regulated, it's controlled. So it's a destination. People stay here for 2 days, 1 night. Look at a show, they walk around, and it's very nice hiking trails and biking. It's like going to a park, going to like an art themed destination. It's not like a small city, hustle and bustle, shops and restaurants. Not like that. It's actually quiet and calm. Yeah.
The cities in China develop very fast. There are, future version. Do you think there will be more accessibility to the public in the future, all the development of the transport, or you presume that this art center will always be a little
Remote?
Remote, yeah, it's always remote to the city towns, or you think that with the future development of the cities, it will be a part of the city center?
I think what she was asking is, when you see cities that expand so fast in China, now you're 1 hour outside of the city, but maybe in 20 years you're actually going to be enrolled in that city. Is that something you thought about?
It's happening already.
Yeah, so how do you look at these questions?
Great.
Agree?
Yeah, of course.
So you're more... I'm very sorry, it's a long time I didn't speak English.
That's okay.
But if you want to ask in French, and we can translate.
This whole area is protected because it's natural. So whatever the city will grow even further, but this area is always protected. It's a national park. Yeah, we're on the edge of the national park. So even on the edge, we're all protected. So there's no more development can be made. The government is very strict on that. But if you're talking about city expanding, you want to ask, yeah, why not? I have no problem with city expanding. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
It's because maybe I don't know the project too well. Again, we question on the project. So there are around 24 units, and there's museum, residency house, and hotel. Are there any other functions inside?
So the four more established office did the four public buildings. So Stephen Hall did the museum, Arato Isozaki did a conference center, and Eto Sosas did a recreational center, and the Japan did a hotel. So these four architects, they kind of spoke amongst themselves and picked a function. Obviously, Arato Isozaki is more fit to do a conference. Obviously, Stephen Hall's character, being a rock star, wants to do the museum. Everybody wants to do the museum, right? Sosas is playful, Memphis movement, beautiful, primary colors. So we made a recreational center. So spa, gym, ping pong, rock climbing, all inside that. Good. And the other 20 are houses, so they share the same function. Obviously, they're of the same, a different design.
And who occupy the houses?
We run them like a resort right now. So people, obviously, the museum is open to public, right? But if you want to stay in the house, you have to book online. Yeah, it's like
That's a hotel. All the houses are a hotel.
yes. Yes. And the artists, because we have a very strong artist residency program, so the artists sometimes occupy the houses. So we don't. That house is not on the booking system.
So Airbnb.
It's almost like
Which Chinese characteristics?
not public. It's the private booking.
And are the visitors, they can go and visit the residency as well?
Sorry.
The visitor can go and visit the residency? Or
Not
is
all
it,
the time.
how is it?
We have guided tours, and oftentimes we change the content of the guided tour depending what's happening on the campus. So a lot can be happening. Sometimes nothing's happening. So it depends what we're doing. Also, the artists sometimes open workshops, open their studios, open their communal spaces on Sundays and on weekends. So it depends. Yeah, we're very free, so we kind of accustom our programs according to what we have on site.
Should we have to cut it off there? So we've been talking for 2 minutes how art is affected by technology, how our experience of art is affected by technology. I just want to thank very much Nicole, Alina,